This week then we're going to be looking at one of the most powerful and also most complicated features in Angular development, which is the idea of observables. Now, observables as a general concept have been around for a long time because they originated as a design pattern in the famous Gang of Four book that came out in the mid-90s. And so they're used in lots and lots of situations, essentially where we have two parts of a program, in one of which you have some kind of stimulus, and in the other of which you have the code that's got to respond to that stimulus, and you want to organise that in such a way that there is the minimum dependency between them, and also in such a way that you can have the one stimulus being displayed in lots of different areas. So the idea is that maybe if you had a word processor with two windows open on the same page of the document, then if you typed in one of them, obviously the new text would appear in that one, but it would also appear in the other one as well. And there's lots and lots of examples like that, and lots of mechanisms that have been used to implement the observer pattern. And so things like events in .NET are a very common way that we implement the observer pattern. When we talk about observables in Angular, though, we're talking about a particular library, the RxJS library, which has implemented this very powerful set of tools and classes that can make us have the observable pattern implemented in a very flexible way. It's not actually just available in Angular. You can use it in other JavaScript libraries, but I'm using it in Angular because that's the one I'm familiar with. And in fact, we already used this briefly in one of our examples, because if you remember the example we had with our book reviews, so what we had here was the code where we were using HTTP client to both get and to post our book reviews. So if I just run this up, then we got that listing from the server, and the request to the server had been made by using the HTTP client get, and then it returns this thing called an observable, which we then had to subscribe to in order to actually get the results and display them. And that's just one simple example. In fact, when we do it with something like an AJAX call, which we're doing there, it's a very simple example of an observable because it only returns the one value. You make the request, get back the result, and that's it. That's the observable finished with. Whereas in fact, the majority of observables can return multiple values, one after another after another. And that could be an infinite sequence that goes on forever, or at least for the duration of your program, or it could terminate after a fixed number, but that number could be greater than one. And so in fact, using the observables with the HTTP client is in a sense a bit of overkill. We could have done that just with the older idea of promises, which we looked at in an earlier video, but in fact, it's easier just to have the same technology for all of them and just have an observable that only gives you back one value as a special case of an observable that gives you back lots of values. But let's start looking at observables that keep on giving. And so if we look at the other Angular app we've got here, and if I run this one up, then we'll see at the moment it's not doing very much. We've got this click me button that doesn't do anything, and then we've got this arrow in a circle. And if we look at the code for that, then we'll see what's actually happening. So there's the button. The arrow in the circle is simply done with this div, and actually all the graphics is done in CSS. And then also, what you can't see at the moment, I've got this unordered list for items in this array called values, which we've got declared in the component. So there's our values array, could be either strings or numbers, but nothing in there as yet, so that's what's not showing. If we just take a look at the CSS, then that is the div, and you can see I've given it a width and height of 15, and I've given it a 50% border radius. And a 50% border radius is just a neat little trick you can do for putting a circle around there. And then in the middle of all that, we've got this background image, which is an SVG, scalable vector graphics. Not going to go into any detail of that. This was actually drawn, as you can see, using Adobe Illustrator, but it doesn't really matter. But it's an arrow, and that's what gives us our arrow in a circle for what we've got there. You'll notice the other thing I did on that was I gave it a rotation of 0 degrees. So that's actually something we're going to start animating using the observable, because if I just change that statically, then we can see it's now turned to 45 degrees. And if we could dynamically change that, we can make it tick around a bit like a clock. So let's do that with observables. So what I'm going to do is go to the TypeScript file, and then I'm going to, in here, declare a particularly convenient type of observable which does not terminate, and that is one called interval. You can see I've prepped things a bit, but I've got my inputs at the top there, so I'm going to start using interval, and then all we need to do with interval is we specify the period in milliseconds between each tick that we're going to have. So I'm going to say 1,000 on that, and so what we're going to do there is this observable will send out a result once a second. And just like we saw with the code for the HTTP client, we then need to subscribe to that. So that's what I'll do here. I'll say .subscribe, and then subscribe takes a parameter. What the parameter is depends on the nature of the observable, but in the case of the HTTP client, we saw it was the actual result, so the array of book reviews that was coming back. Here, the interval simply gives you a counter of how many times it's called back. So if I just put count on there and then use an arrow function, and what I'm going to do is on that values, so I'm going to say this dot values dot push, and then push in the count. So what we should see there is just on each time, once a second, that this observable sends out a new value, we'll get that displayed. And so if we save that and switch to the view, we can see there is that unordered list that, remember, had the array of values, let value of values. So that is just counting out that we've got each value being added in there. And as we say, that doesn't terminate. Another example we could have of one that doesn't terminate is we can use observables to respond to events from the DOM. So remember, we've got this button that I've hooked up to the code there. So what I could do is I could have another observable called from event, and then we pass into that the element that's going to give us the event. So this dot button dot native element you've got to put there, and then also the name of the event that we're going to be listening for, which is click. And then in that case I could do another subscribe, and in this case we get back the event, which I'm not actually interested in, and I'm just going to say this dot values dot push, and then let's just put the message to say that it's been clicked. And so now we've got another example of one that doesn't terminate, but it doesn't repeat regularly, it only repeats when the user actually clicks the button. So again, if we go back in there, we can see there come the numbers 1, 2, 3, etc. And then if I do click, we get the click inserted into that. And again, it doesn't terminate, I can keep on clicking, but it doesn't regularly emit unless I have actually clicked the button. Okay, so that's what we've got there. Now what we'd like to do is hook that up to make this dial start rotating in a nice way. So what we need to do is put on our component a field called rotation, and then we'll just give that an initial value of 0. So that's what we've got there. And then what we'll do is back in our HTML in here, rather than having that fixed 45 degrees, we can do this. We can just break that up and put plus and then rotation that comes from the component, and so that should now rotate by whatever we said. So if we save all that, we should initially see that's rotated at 0, pointing straight up. But if I were to change the value here, let's say 90, so we can see that's changed, but it's still static. So what we now need to do is make it so that that rotation is being set when we do the interval every second. So what we're now going to do is simply in here say rotation equals count. And so now if we look at that, we should be able to see that it's clicking on every second and starting to move around. But it's not precisely what we want, because if we want this to represent a clock, it should really tick once a second, which it's doing, but it should go around a 60th of the entire rotation if we want that to represent seconds. Now, there's various ways we could do that. We could obviously just do a multiplication in there, but it brings us on to the next really nice feature that we have with observables, which is the idea of pipes and operators. And what this basically does is we can take the observable as a stream of data and manipulate that stream step by step to change the outcome. So what I would do here is, before the subscribe, I could say .pipe, and then I can chain together a number of operations that I would like to perform on the value that's coming through, so the count that we eventually ended up with, that could change it in all sorts of ways. It could change the value, but it could change its type, it could do things completely differently. And so the one I want to do here, I'm going to say map, and so map allows us to convert each value as it comes through into a different value using some kind of transformation. So I'm going to say count gives, and then the problem is we've got 360 degrees in a circle and we want a 60th of that, so that should come to 6 degrees per second. So we need to say count times 6. Okay, so what comes into this map is the count value, what goes out is the count multiplied by 6. And in fact, to make it a bit clearer, let's change the variable name, because this is now, I guess we should say degrees. It's the number of degrees that we want it to move by. It doesn't make any difference to the code, but I always find when you're doing these things, naming those variables as they go through each stage of this process can make it a lot clearer when you or someone else is reading the code. So now if we save that, we can now see that it's ticking at the right amount per second. So that should get us round to the 3 o'clock position in 15 seconds. I should actually put back in the code to display the numbers as well, so we can just see what's happening. So let's also put in there our push once again, but this time we put degrees in there. And so now we should be able to see that as well as it ticking, we can see the numbers going through, and we've got 6 times whatever the value is. There's actually tons more we can do with any of that. So another example of what we could do is actually we can do what's known as a filter. So if I wanted to do something like this, I could say filter, and then this one again we should call degrees, and this basically means we're only going to allow through values that match a certain criterion. So if we do something silly like say we're only going to match this if the degrees are divisible by 10, then we could say degrees modulus 10, and only if that equals 0 are we going to allow these through. So that will mean we've firstly done the conversion, but then we filter it so that only if that is true do we get the result. And now if we look at that, we should see we get 0 because 0 is divisible by 10, but we won't get anything again for quite a while because the next number in our sequence, as we can see, is 30, and then the next one will be 60, and so on and so forth. Maybe a bit of an odd thing for you to want to do, but it's very powerful what it can do here. And there are really so many of these different operators that can be applied to observables that I certainly don't know all of them. I try to learn quite a few as I go along, but it's always a case you're going to need to look them up. Good place to look is a site called learnrxjs.io, and then under there if you do /learn-rxjs/operators, and I'll put the link up for that, that will show you all of these operators and describe how they work. Okay, so we've seen map, we've seen filter. Let's have a look at another one as well. This is a handy little one, particularly for debugging, I find, called tap. And what tap does is simply allows you to put in any bit of code you like that will get executed as the observable is working through the various operators within the pipe. So what I'm going to do here is for degrees, I'm just going to say console.log, and then we could say value is, and then just put the degrees in there. And notice where that comes after the map but before the filter. So if we save that now, we can see that it's not changed anything on there. We're still just getting it through 0, 30, etc. But if we look at the console, then we can see we're getting value is, and then we're getting the multiplied by 6 versions because that happened before we did the filter. So that's what we've got with all of that. So it just takes it through those things, does the processing, and gives us the result. And we can see that's quite nice. That said, there is something that you really need to be aware of with observables because it's one of the easiest mistakes to make and one of the hardest ones to spot. And this comes down to the fact that observables are what is known as lazy. And what that means is, even if you create an observable like we've done there, if you never subscribe to that observable, it will never start going. And so if we didn't put this subscribe in here, then however much we've put in terms of operators within that pipe, nothing will happen because there's nothing kind of on the end pulling it all through. And so our tap, particularly, is the thing to notice, will not get executed. So if I save that one and look at the page, then obviously we're not getting any data coming through. But we're equally, if we look at the console, we're not getting those taps coming through because the observable just is not running at all. Now, a really tricky practical example of where that can cause you problems is if we go back to our book review repository. And remember, we have this add review. So if we look at the page for that one, we know that we've got this add review where I can click on that and I can put in a review for something like, let's just do Emma, give Emma a review of 4, click add, and we get Emma added in there. And the reason we saw Emma being displayed is because in the add review, when I did the post, I subscribed to that, and then when we got back the result, which I don't care about, but I then did the load reviews, and that's why the page refreshed. But if we suppose we didn't worry about that, we didn't need to have the page refreshed, you might think I could just comment that out. But that would cause real problems because if I now go to the server and put a break on the post there, which we should still get called, you'd think, and then if I go back and add another one, let's do another one for Emma and click add, then you'll see we didn't hit that breakpoint at all. The reason being that because we never subscribed, the observable was never activated and therefore it never sent the post request to the server. So that's the situation where we really do have to remember to subscribe. If I put that back in and then do the same process, then we do hit the breakpoint because it's sent off. So you've got to remember sometimes if your observable is doing something, even if you're not specifically interested in the result, you still have to remember to put the subscribe on there. And so what we need to do here is just make sure we leave that on. And so now we're back and ticking. And in fact, let's make that a bit nicer by getting rid of the filter because we wanted it to tick once a second. So we can see that now happening in the correct way. Now actually, although I've said you've got to subscribe, there is a slight problem with using subscribe in the direct way that we can see it there. Because in certain circumstances, subscribe can actually cause your observable to leak. Which basically means that if you then navigated away from this component, which is the thing subscribing to it, if you didn't shut down correctly, then you would have the problem that it would still be emitting the values even though no one was listening to it. That doesn't actually happen when we're dealing with the HTTP one because that sorts it out for itself. But as a general problem, it can happen. And there is a design pattern that I'll show you in a later video that you can put into your component to make it so that it shuts down in a friendly way. But actually, there is a much neater way of doing that that we can achieve in Angular without having to worry about that. And that's to use a thing called the async pipe. Now, pipes are something in Angular that's typically used for relatively cosmetic effects on something we have on our page. So, for example, if I just put in here span, and then I could put a data binding, and let's put in 123.456, then obviously enough, that will display as literally what we asked for, 123.456. But if I use a pipe, I could say use the currency pipe. So I could say currency and then specify the units. So let's go for GBP. And then if I now save that, you can see it's formatted it with the pound symbol and also to 2 decimal places, which is what you'd normally expect. So that's the idea of a pipe. Quite a neat thing we can do there. But also we have a really powerful pipe in Angular called the async pipe, which is intended to deal with situations where we want to bind to the results from an observable. So what we'll do here is let's go back to the code and actually, rather than just declaring that interval pipe there, we'll declare this as a member of the component. So it'll be accessible in the template. So I'm going to call this interval, but I'm going to follow that with a $. Now this is purely a naming convention, so you don't have to use it, but quite a lot of people like to do this so that simply by looking at the code we know that that variable contains an observable, and therefore we can't just access the data in a completely straightforward way. So we're going to say interval equals, and then if I just take that declaration and pop it in there, then that gives us our interval as a member. Let's get rid of the subscribe there. And if you just hover over that, you'll notice the type of this. It is observable of number. So if I'd wanted to, I could have put in here observable angle brackets number, because remember, number is what we're getting out of there, because degrees is a number. The last thing that came out of that map is going to be a number. Though good practice is, given that TypeScript can infer the type, we don't normally bother to explicitly say it because it can still see that it's an observable of number. Now if we were to just to take that interval and go to our component and maybe just in here put interval $, then when we save that and look at the results, it's not going to be very pretty, because all it does is tries to display this observable, which is a complex object, so all it can do is display it as an object. But then we can do the really neat thing, which is we can use this async pipe. So just like I had with the currency pipe, we use the pipe symbol itself and then async. And now, when we look at that, we can see the values coming through. They're not being pushed onto the array anymore, it's just the current value, but we can see each of those values coming through every second. And the really nice thing about that async is, although underneath the covers, it clearly does have to subscribe, it tidies up after itself. So you won't get this issue of leaking if you do the async pipe. And so best practice is normally to try and avoid subscribes as much as possible. And if you do everything through an async pipe, that'll be a lot tidier. So that really gives us what we need now, because back up here on the rotation, if I just take that bit of code and put it in there, and then also put it in brackets just so it knows the precedence. And so now, when we look at that, we can see that it's now ticking round with the 6 degrees every second. Let's just do a bit of tidying up. So if we go back to here, we can now see we no longer need that rotation at all, because it's all just being done in that interval $, which is using the async pipe to bind onto what we have there. So that was it, our first look at observables, and quite a simple approach to them, but we've seen how we can have an observable that terminates or an observable that doesn't terminate. We can see how we can use the pipe to apply these operators like filter and map and tap and things like that. We saw that you can subscribe to an observable, and indeed you have to subscribe if you want the observable to start running, but that we can subscribe in Angular using that async pipe, which tidies up after itself. And you can see very quickly we've been able to put together this kind of clock that shows us the way that the interval observer works. So lots more to cover on observables. I won't be doing it week after week. We'll probably have some other subjects in the way, but hope you enjoyed that. If you did, do click the like button, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.